Hey folks, this is the legislative update for this week in Washington, D.C. First of all, great to be and important to be back here doing the people's work after weeks and weeks of this partial shutdown. So we're going to start out with the Epstein files. As you know, we voted, the House and the Senate voted almost unanimously to move that forward, to release that stuff. And as you probably know, I have requested the release of this now for years. In particular, contacting the United States Attorney General on multiple occasions, not only to release the important parts of the grand jury investigation, but to make sure that a special prosecutor was named in this action, to make sure that Ghislaine Maxwell was in protective custody while in prison so she didn't suffer a fate similar to Jeffrey Epstein's, and to subpoena every single United States Attorney General that ever dealt with the Jeffrey Epstein issue. So of course I voted in favor of the resolution, but let me just say this too. I was hopeful that the Senate was gonna do some repairs to the bill, because I do have some concerns that victims would be unnecessarily revealed, or that people that really had nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein other than a casual mention in some kind of file would then become victimized. Now that didn't happen, but for the sake, so I don't blame, there was one member of the House that voted against it for specifically those reasons, and I certainly don't blame him for that. For me, I had to weigh the trust of the American people in the judicial system over that. And at this point, I think that probably a whole lot of that information has already been out. The women that have been abused that want to speak on it already have revealed themselves. And so that's the calculation, that's how I weighed that about what was most important. And again, I hope that the Senate would make those repairs, but they did not. So in any case, that is now done. Now, of course, in conjunction with that, we considered censuring a United States delegate. She's not a representative because she represents a territory and they don't get a vote on the floor, but Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands, because it's not a question of fact now. She was texting directly with Jeffrey Epstein during a hearing, and this is post his conviction as a child trafficker, prostitution, involved in prostitution and in child prostitution. So, and also receiving campaign contributions from a convicted pedophile. So the question is do you really want someone like that serving on the Intelligence Committee, knowing that she not only did those things, but she was the Assistant United States Attorney for the Virgin Islands, which, by the way, is in the vicinity or in the location of where Epstein Island was located. While I voted for it, the measure failed, so she will continue to serve on intelligence. All right, so I think that answers everything you need to know about the Epstein files, is my understanding, based on the bill that the release that the Department of Justice is going to complete will be done within 30 days of enactment, which happened this last Wednesday when the president signed it. Okay. Let's talk about a couple hearings that we did this week. We did one on Burma, and I don't know whether you know this or not, but there's a military junta, another dictator that has taken over Burma, otherwise known as Myanmar. These things go back and forth, but he just kind of took over and disregarded the openly elected leadership in that country. You might say, why do I care what's happening in Burma? Well, unfortunately, because of the lawlessness in Burma, there are organized crime syndicates and also affiliated with the Communist Party of China that steal billions of dollars from Americans with the sovereignty or with the protection that is provided to them by operating out of Burma. And so not only that, but it also destabilizes the region and provides an opportunity and an outlet for China and other nefarious actors to do nefarious things in the country which threaten U.S. interests around the globe. So we had a hearing on that, trying to determine how, in fact, to fix that situation as best we can. and for my part, without spending more American tax dollars in doing that. And I think there are some opportunities to do that. We also had a hearing on export controls regarding computer chips, which is really, really important. Unfortunately, the most important computer chips that are made in America sometimes and somehow find their way into the Communist Party of China's hands. You might say, why do I care? You should care because we are in a race for artificial intelligence with the Communist Party of China. And whoever loses that race is likely never to be able to catch up to the other country. The pathway to us winning that race is through these chips. China cannot produce them. They do not have the technology. We do. We're trying to keep it from them. They're trying to steal it or acquire it any way that they can. And of course, when you further say, why do I care if China gets it and they win the race? Because if they win the race, there's no more free America. There's no more free speech. The system of governance of China then becomes more across other countries, including the United States of America. I'm talking about 24-hour surveillance and government control of everything that you hear and see, and then what you think. And we don't want that. So that's why this is important, among a million other reasons. All right, so those were the hearings. We did a couple or a few congressional review acts, or we call them CRAs. So what happens is when an administration is making rules within a certain amount of time, when the administration leaves, Congress can review those rules and say, are these lawful? Should they remain in effect or not? And we can rescind them. So that's a Congressional Review Act. We rescinded a few. One is to the Biden administration said we cannot mine for coal on federal lands in Wyoming. Now, we're mining for coal elsewhere. We do other things on federal lands. Prior to that, mining coal was a legal opportunity and operation on federal lands. We just returned that provision. So now we can mine coal on federal lands in Wyoming. Also, the same thing for the Bureau of Land Management on the coastal plain, the oil and gas leasing program. So we stopped a bunch of oil and gas leasing on the coastal plains, again, federal lands, but we want to allow that because America needs that. So private industry then leases the land, goes and does the exploration, and pays the United States of America to do the exploration and for any minerals or the natural resources they extract. Same thing, another one for the Anwar Wildlife Reserve in Alaska. So those were 3 CRAs. And you might say, well, why do I care about that? And you should say that. You care about that because this is American energy. And if you've noticed your electricity bill recently or over the last 4, 5, 10 years, it continues to go up. It continues to go up because the policies from the federal and state government make it harder and harder for us to produce energy cheaply, affordably, and reliably. And these are the policies that have done that. By reversing them over time, you will see your electricity and energy bills stabilize, if not come down, as more energy comes onto the market. It's simply the law of supply and demand. The more we have, the less it costs, and the easier it is for you to afford. So that's why it should matter to you. And then finally, what do we got here? We dealt with some D.C. crime bills. As you probably know, Washington, D.C. is a federal enclave by the Constitution. That means that the Congress and the federal government gets to administer much of it. Now, we've given D.C. the right to do a lot of that themselves, but sometimes they go too far. For instance, in the case of cashless bail. So people were being arrested for whatever crime. They don't have to provide any bail, and they're back out on the streets. And of course, crime was rampant. We think that that's not the way to go. We want to see America's capital be able to be visited by people without the fear of being robbed or shot or kidnapped or have their car taken or something like that. But with cashless bail, there was no incentive to keep criminals in or to keep criminals from committing the same crimes over and over again. So we ended that system. The other thing we did was we took policing back to pre-George Floyd time, because prior to George Floyd, police were allowed to do what they're supposed to do, protect and keep us safe. But post-George Floyd, they were required to do all kinds of other things and that were actually in favor of the criminal. Again, we want criminals to be in jail. We want our streets to be safe in the United States Capitol. So we return to policing when policing allowed the officers and those people that choose that to do what they love to do and what we want them to do, which is enforce the law and keep us safe. Finally, we passed a bill regarding the horrors of socialism. We want to make sure that Americans are all aware of what socialism is. In this day and age, there are some people that haven't really been taught this in school. They might think that socialism has to do with social media. Socialism is a form of government that strips you of all your rights and give them to the government. And it has not worked anywhere that it has been tried. As a matter of fact, it has led to a path of destruction and just horror for humanity. And in the case of Joseph Stalin, tens of millions of people dead. In the case of Pol Pot, again, tens of millions of people dead. Everywhere it has been tried, it has destroyed the soul of the people that are oppressed by it, and it has destroyed literally tens of millions of lives. And because it is creeping up in America, we want to make sure that Americans are aware of what this is. So why does it matter to you? You live in a country where you're free to say what you want, think what you want, have the opportunity to pursue your dreams. In a socialist system, all that goes away. The government decides what you're allowed to say, which of course that impacts on what you think, and they decide on, in the Soviet Union, whether you wanted to be a jet pilot or a physicist. The government might have determined that you're going to be a wheat farmer, and that's what you were going to do. We don't want to live in that kind of system where the government is going to control, and we're concerned that our education institutions aren't teaching that anymore. So we passed that bill so Americans are aware of the horrors of socialism. Okay, so folks, that wraps up the legislative week. So we hope you have a safe weekend, and we'll see you on the next legislative week.